What if love were just an elegant way to approach the abyss? What if every promise whispered softly carried, hidden behind the words, the silent weight of guilt? What if what we most desire to know is, in truth, what can destroy us? These questions have haunted me since the day I crossed the rusted gate of the old mansion, where every window seemed to watch me with a memory I had yet to live. There are places that should never be revisited, voices that should never be heard again, but the human heart, in its tragic stubbornness, insists on returning to where it once bled. Perhaps that what separates us from the dead, the desire to understand what should have been forgotten. There was something in the way the wind cut through the valley that morning, as if nature itself were trying to warn me, but fate doesn't speak loudly, it whispers, and I, blinded by longing, mistook the warning for a call. Time, when looked at closely, isn't a line, it's a broken mirror, and each fragment reflects a different version of who we were. Some versions are gentle, almost beautiful, others monstrous, deformed by what we hide. I never knew which one I saw when I thought of her, maybe because deep down I feared recognizing what was left of me after what she had done. She kept a secret I once believed belonged only to her. But secrets are living organisms. They breathe, they grow, and in time, they find a way to escape. Hers found its way through me. There are memories that don't belong to this world, memories that insist on returning like fog, blurring the line between dream, recollection, and delirium. When I close my eyes, I still sense the jasmine scent drifting through the halls, the faint sound of footsteps that weren't mine, the rhythmic ticking of a clock that never stopped, even after everyone had gone. And always, between sound and silence, the feeling that she was still there, waiting for me to remember. They say true love survives death, but what happens when it's the cause of it? The walls of that house held more than stories. They held intentions, regrets, and promises made at midnight. I had promised to return, and I did. Not to fulfill something, but to understand what was left behind. The truth is, there's no such thing as an innocent return. Every time we go back to a place, we bring along what we've become since we left. And sometimes that's more dangerous than any ghost. As I walked through the main corridor, each step echoed as if I were treading on memories. The wood groaned in response, as if recognizing my weight. The air smelled of aged paper and damp earth, and beneath it all, an ancient chill that seemed to come from within me. Long ago, she had asked me for a promise. "Don't come back," she said with her eyes, though silence was all that remained between us. But love, or what was left of it, has always been stronger than reason. Now, as I crossed that house again, I realized every wall seemed to watch me with a kind of quiet mercy, as if they knew what I was about to discover. The hall clock still marked the same time as when we left. It was as if time itself had been condemned to repeat the moment of our farewell. The shadows of the curtain swayed slowly, like weary ghosts tired of waiting. Everything looked the same, but nothing truly was. Something, or someone, was still there. And then I realized the secret she kept wasn't buried beneath the floor, nor locked in a forgotten room. It was alive, and it pulsed silently within the house. The door to the main hall creaked open, and the familiar scent of old wood mixed with the bittersweet aroma of dried flowers filled the air. It was in that moment I understood. The past is not a place one returns to. It is a visitor that never left. And so my descent began, not toward hell, but toward the place where memory and desire intertwine, and where love ceases to be a promise and becomes a curse. That house was not merely the setting of a lost love. It was the body that housed the spirit of all I refused to remember. And as the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass, I realized that nothing I would find there would be mere memory. It would be confession. The house seemed to breathe. Not in a natural way, but with the kind of breath one notices only when the silence is too deep. Every wall exhaled an ancient air, thick with memories floating between the furniture covered in yellowed sheets. Dust danced in the beams of light crossing the windows, and in each suspended particle, something seemed to look back at me. I don't know how long I stood there, just watching. There was a gravity to that place, an invisible force pulling me inward as if each room had its own magnetic field, powered by memories I wasn't yet ready to face. The sound of the wind outside was muffled, and yet it felt as though the house was listening. To the thud of my boots, the creak of the floorboards, even the quickened rhythm of my heart. The first rooms were drenched in a yellowish twilight, the wallpaper peeled away in long strips as if the house itself were shedding its skin. Beneath those worn layers, traces of what once was a home could be seen. Old portraits, cracked frames, furniture that still bore the shape of the hands that once touched them. The dining table still displayed faint rings of wine glasses and small, dark stains, like scars from an interrupted feast. I climbed the stairs feeling as though I were violating something sacred. The handrail was cold, damp, and when I ran my hand over it, a trace of mold stained my fingers. The touch of time. With every step, her memory grew sharper, more present. I could almost hear her footsteps. Light, precise, as though the whole house knew who followed her. She used to say that places keep the echoes of the people we love. That when someone leaves, the emptiness they leave behind isn't silence. It's the sound that remains, stubborn and insistent. Perhaps that's why, even years later, her presence could still be felt there, spread through corners, soaked into curtains, books, and dried flowers. Her room was at the end of the corridor, the same hallway I used to walk quickly through when I was young, consumed by a mix of desire and fear. Now I moved slowly, feeling the air grow heavier as I neared it. The windows were veiled by faded curtains, and the light that filtered in seemed hesitant, as if afraid to reveal too much. The doorknob, cold as freshly dug metal, turned with a dry click. The room was a portrait of absence, the mirror covered, the bed untouched, the old scent still lingering in the air. Nothing had changed. Not even the embroidered quilt she loved so much. The tiny blue flowers were faded by time, but strong enough to resist the dust. Then I noticed something that didn't belong. A picture frame, face down on the dresser. Dust covered everything, except it. I picked it up carefully, and when I turned it over, my stomach sank. It was our portrait, taken the last winter we spent together. A shiver ran through me, not from cold, but from the realization that someone had placed it there recently. The dust around it was untouched, yet the glass gleamed, polished, almost new. Memories fluttered like trapped birds. That winter, the last before the silence. I could still see the fire glowing in the hearth, the snow falling outside, and her lying beside me, eyes closed, murmuring something I never managed to understand. It was there in that room that time broke apart, and everything that followed was just the shadow of what we once were. I walked to the window and opened it. The cold air rushed in, lifting dust and making the curtains tremble. For a moment, the house seemed to awaken, the distant groan of doors, the faint creak of wood. And in the air, a sound, almost imperceptible, like someone sighing. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The wind carried the scent of the garden, that ancient blend of soil and jasmine, the same perfume she used to wear. And for the first time, I felt fear. Not of what I might find, but of what might have been with me all along. When I looked again at the covered mirror, I noticed something strange. Beneath the cloth was a dark mark, stretching like the outline of hands. I approached and slowly lifted the fabric. The reflection revealed a face, mine. But for an instant, I swear I saw another, overlaid, almost fused with it. I lowered the cloth immediately, my heart pounding. I tried to laugh at my imagination, but the sound died before leaving my lips, because deep down I knew. That house had never been just a place. It was a body, and inside it, something was still alive. I walked to the door and before leaving, glanced at the portrait one last time. In the lower corner, barely visible, was a small mark, a letter carved with something sharp. Her initial, a reminder, or perhaps a calling. I descended the stairs slowly, feeling the floor give slightly beneath my feet. The air in the house felt heavier now, as if it knew I had seen too much. In the hall, the old clock still showed the same hour, but this time the pendulum moved, slowly, swaying like a tired heart refusing to stop. And it was in that moment I realized time had begun to move again, and with it her secret, ready to be revealed. The sound was faint, uneven, but unmistakable. A slow, shallow breath, seeming to come from within the walls. I stood still, trying to tell whether it came from upstairs, the staircase, or somewhere deeper in the house. The wind outside had stopped, and the silence magnified everything. Every tiny noise became a threat. For a moment I thought it was my imagination, that solitude and the weight of memories were playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a sigh, fragile, almost human. And what terrified me most wasn't the sound itself, but what it awakened within me, a feeling of recognition. It was as if that breath carried a familiar rhythm, the distant echo of something I once loved. I followed the sound down the side corridor, where the light crumbled into pale particles. The walls were covered with old portraits, all slightly crooked, their frames eaten away by time. With each step, the sound grew sharper, and with it, a growing sense that I was not alone. When I pushed the door open, the creak shattered the silence like a confession. The room was small, an old studio. The windows were covered, but I could still make out the outline of easels, canvases, dried brushes, and hardened jars of paint. The air inside was different, heavier, as if time itself had stopped circulating. And in the center, a canvas facing the wall. I approached it slowly, feeling the floor moan beneath the weight of each memory. Dust rose in soft clouds, floating like mist. When I touched the frame, I felt something damp. It wasn't paint, nor water. It was as if the painting were still breathing. I turned it over slowly, and there she was. Not a perfect portrait, but a nearly living painting. Brushstrokes that seemed to pulse. The eyes, though made of pigment, held a depth that defied reason. They seemed to recognize me. It was the same gaze from the night she left. For an instant I forgot where I was. The air thinned, and I felt certain the figure on the canvas would blink at any moment. I stepped back, my heartbeat uneven, and let the painting lean against the wall. My breath stopped, but the silence now carried an unbearable weight. I returned to the corridor, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I passed the portraits again, and I swear, for a brief second, their gazes had changed. They were following me. I descended the stairs again, seeking the cool air drifting from the hall. The clock still swung in its hypnotic rhythm, swaying between the shadows. And then I saw something that hadn't been there before. A trail of petals. Small, white, fresh. Jasmine. I followed the trail to the main hall. The petals formed a winding path that ended before a double door. The library. The library had once been the heart of the house, the place where she spent hours writing, reading, dreaming. It was also where she kept her notebooks, her notes, her letters. That room was the mirror of her mind, and I knew whatever was hidden there could answer questions I had never dared to ask. I pushed the door open, and the sound of the hinges was like a lament. The room was dark, lit only by the diffuse glow from a tall window. The smell of old paper mingled with the sweet scent of flowers, as if the past were slowly burning away. On the central table, a pile of books lay open, their yellowed pages filled with faded ink. I approached. Between the pages, an envelope. Sealed. My name written by hand. My heart raced. The handwriting was hers, firm, yet trembling, as if written in haste. I touched the paper gently, and a faint current ran through my fingers. I opened it. Inside, only a single sheet. A short, solitary sentence. If you've come back, it means you already know too much. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I felt the weight of each word like chains. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. How could she have known I would return? How could she have foreseen this moment? A thunderclap echoed in the distance as if the sky itself had chosen to confirm my dread. The light flickered, and for an instant, the shadow on the wall seemed to move on its own. The house breathed once more. I sat at the table, trying to understand. The books scattered around seemed carefully chosen, titles about time, memory, and what remains after death. And there, among them, a leather-bound notebook, old but intact. I opened it. The first pages were filled with notes in a handwriting I knew well, though now disordered. There were dates, fragments of sentences, sketches of faces, and symbols I didn't recognize. On one page, a passage underlined with force, "Memory is the body of the soul." And just below, a name, mine, written with an almost tender delicacy. A knot tightened in my throat. She had kept writing about me, even after she was gone, even after the end. The following pages were stained, perhaps by tears, perhaps by ink, and at the end a fragment, cut off mid-sentence. "If he ever returns, what is trapped here will need to wake." I shut the notebook suddenly. Wind hissed through the window cracks, snuffing out the lamplight. Darkness flooded the room, and outside the ticking of the clock fell silent once more. That's when I heard it. 3 soft knocks, coming from upstairs. And then I understood. I wasn't merely reliving memories, I was being summoned by them. And the knocks came methodically as if obeying an ancient ritual. 3, 2, 1. Then silence. The silence wasn't absence. It was substance, filling every crevice, pressing against the air, creating a tension words couldn't describe. I climbed the stairs again, each step groaning in rhythm, like a heart, as if the house itself were trying to remind me of a forgotten beat. The corridor felt longer than before, as though the architecture stretched itself to match the size of my fear. The air was dense, damp like a flooded cellar, clinging to my skin, clouding my breath. The doors along both sides watched me with the same feverish restraint as the portraits, and I had the sense that if I opened any of them, I would find not a room, but the continuation of a thought I had abandoned years ago. The knocks came again, now precise, 3 sharp strikes, coming from the far end of the corridor, where a cluster of shadows formed an impossible angle with the wall. As I approached, I saw what I didn't remember existing: a narrow door, almost at the level of the baseboard, as if built for someone smaller, or something that preferred to crawl. The latch, cold and sticky, resisted for a moment before yielding with a metallic sigh that seemed to betray my presence to the house itself. Beyond it, a short passage, an esophagus of damp stone, led to what had once been a child's room. The low ceiling, the faded floral wallpaper, a motionless mobile, hanging like an omen. There was dust on everything, but not old dust. It seemed freshly disturbed, like the goosebumps of time itself. In the corner, an empty cradle, stripped of all tenderness. On the dresser, a small pocket watch lay open, its glass cracked like a weary eye, the second hand frozen at the same minute shown by the clock in the hall. Her memory crossed the room in the form of a scent, jasmine, but now mixed with wet cloth, iron, and the bittersweet note of overripe fruit. I remembered the gesture she used when she wanted to silence a storm within herself. She would touch her wrist count between her teeth without moving her lips, and rest her forehead on my shoulder as if a shelter existed there. In that short eternity of a room, the gesture returned as an image that struck back, echoing against the shell of my bones. Beneath the dresser, a very light wooden box. The latch held no lock, only the delicacy of a whisper waiting to be heard. Inside, small objects of no value to the world, a faded ribbon, the torn edge of a photograph where no one was fully visible, and a strand of hair tied with an almost invisible thread. The texture of those remnants clung to my skin with the sting of an unkept promise. Beneath them all, folded in 4, a rough sheet of paper with a single line written in haste: "We do not cradle what was never born." I closed the box gently, not out of pity, but reverence. That sentence was a blade reopening an ancient wound, and I refused to bleed there. I turned toward the mobile, which swayed ever so slightly despite the still air. Its little wooden birds seemed trapped in flight without sky, and their strings cast thin shadows across the wall like the notes of a song no one dared to play. At the baseboard, an irregularity broke the pattern of the planks, the kneeling mark of time, a faint rectangular cut, almost imperceptible, but not to someone who had learned to read the script of hiding places. I pried it open with my nails and the wood yielded, revealing a narrow space where my arm fit up to the elbow. My fingers brushed something hard, wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out carefully. It was a leather-bound book, so worn it no longer bore a title. The leather had the indifferent temperature of objects tired of being touched. I opened it on the dresser. The first pages were blank, as if the story had forgotten itself. Then came sheets where the ink had spread like leaf veins, forming narrow letters, her handwriting, bound by an urgency that touched everything but the surface. I read without breathing, as if trying not to alert the water I was crossing. They were not diaries nor letters. They were instructions. Notes on how to tend to the house in my absence, rules of silence and caution. And in the margins, observations about things no one would dare admit aloud. The corridor responds to the weight of guilt. Avoid mirrors after the 10th knock. Never leave whole flowers in the library. Never open the door to the left of the hall if the clock has stopped. It wasn't madness. It was method. The kind of method born when reality chooses to disobey and must be tamed like a wild creature that knows the names of the night. The middle pages were stuck together. When I separated them, a sour, slightly metallic smell rose from the paper. There, a list of dates without context, as if someone had tried to inventory the return of something that had never left. On some of those dates, my name appeared beside a mark, pressed with the weight of a hand. On others, the same mark, without a name, as if it referred to something we both shared but neither of us had the courage to name. On the last entry, the letters trembled as if written standing up in the dark. If he returns, do not let him go to the back room until he first acknowledges what he lost. I closed the book and felt the simple, cruel vertigo of certainties shattering. I had not come back to remember. I had come back to acknowledge. And one only acknowledges what still hurts. The pocket watch on the dresser advanced 1 second on its own, skirting its paralysis like an animal that decides to move only its tail to announce it. Still alive. The pendulum in the hall answered, as if the house had aligned its mechanical hearts with my hesitation. I carried the book back into the corridor. Behind me, the mobile moved again, without wind, without hand. The corridor greeted me with a cellar's breath and a brief puff of perfume. I went down the stairs, and each step seemed to measure the thickness of my footfall. In the hall, the clock marked a new minute, yet the room was still trapped in the same uncertain dusk, the color of washed glass. The instruction in the book spoke of the door on the left side of the hall. The door was there, discreet, unadorned, like an apology, like a belated request. I already knew it and at the same time had never truly seen it. The doorknob had the oiliness of things touched in fear, and the metal returned to my fingers a physical memory. The exact weight of her hand when she insisted I shouldn't insist. I turned it slowly. The wood separated from the frame with the sound of a lip peeling away, and a smaller, even narrower corridor opened like a secret that finally decides to speak in full. The walls were raw, rustic, and there were niches in them, small enough to hold the devotion of a single object. In some, candles burned to the end, in others, dried petals. In others still, small scraps of fabric that belonged to no clothing in the world. The stone floor felt cold through my soles, and the air smelled like the inside of a trunk closed for years. Ahead, a final door waited. Not a door, but the synthesis of every door that had refused me passage, with a lock that seemed built from the inside. I looked to the book as if it could answer in my stead. A page turned by itself even without wind, revealing a rough drawing, a ring of keys, a ribbon, and beneath, a brief note. The only key does not open, it recognizes. In the coat lining, where my hands rest in unacceptable moments, I found what I didn't even remember bringing. An old ribbon, the same fabric that slept in the box from the nursery, and attached to it a short key, shallow-toothed, the head marked with her initial. It was far too light for the gravity of what it promised. I brought it to the lock. The metal didn't respond with the obedient click of well-tuned mechanisms. Instead, it quivered almost imperceptibly, as if a deep muscle in the house had sensed the approach and decided to ready itself. The book grew heavy on my arm, and the corridor concentrated into silence, pushing the rest of the world outside its walls. The key's tip touched the slit, and in the same instant, the clocks of the house, all of them, from forgotten rooms to the hall, began a misaligned mechanical chant, a chorus of beats and delays as if time had lost its shame before my gesture. I pressed. The lock did not yield. Rather, it recognized. A chill climbed through my joints, crossed the elbow, settled in my shoulder, and came to rest at the nape, where the oldest part of fear lives. The metal warmed, but the air grew colder, and whatever was on the other side approached like a weightless presence, a new density occupying the space before me, pushing me gently back, like an embrace that refuses absurdity. The book, held against my chest, loosened between my fingers. The cover opened one last time, and a loose sheet slipped out, fluttering like a tired bird choosing the only branch left to land on. Upon it, in the brevity of someone who understood too late, the handwriting read, "There is no secret without a body." The doorknob turned by itself a millimeter, enough for the door to breathe and return to the corridor a gust of air from another season, carrying a garden that no longer existed and a laugh I believed had no place in the world of things that persist. I understood then that the house did not merely want to be invaded, it wanted to be remembered with the whole body. And the only way to remember with the body is to accept the wound. I remained there, on the edge of what was owed me. Behind the door, a whisper gathered into texture but not into word. It wasn't to voice and yet seemed to say my name the way only a presence that knows us from within can say it. The hall clock, punctual for the first time, struck the hour with liturgical cruelty. At the instant I raised my hand to complete the gesture and open, I felt the sweet, terrible weight of everything that had been promised between us and never fulfilled. The house, the book, the ribbon, the nursery, the instructions, the phrase kept like a thorn. Everything converged on that point, like lines of a map leading back to a center that will never be again. And I understood without revelation but with certainty. Beyond that door there was not only the answer to the mystery, there was the continuity of love in the form of what it ruined. I met the lock's gaze as one looks into a mirror that does not reflect. The corridor held its breath. The metal warmed one more degree, and the door finally began to give inward, revealing the first blade of compact darkness, thick as an unspoken vow. The book slid from my arm and touched the floor with a short sound that seemed to run down the corridor like a spark of meanings. I drew a deep breath. I entered. On the other side, the darkness was not absence. It was substance, as if someone had distilled the night until it turned liquid, and then poured it over the floor. My first step sank a little, not because of mud, but because of the weight of what was stored there. Dense recollections, memories that had grown a body. The air was colder, and at the same time more intimate, like the inside of a music box about to play. The door closed behind me without a sound. It wasn't a startle, it was an acceptance. As if whatever awaited me there had never admitted the possibility of my escape. Slowly, the half-light took on texture. The outline of walls covered in fabric, a low table with a wrinkled cloth, a chair set slightly out of place, and to the right, what looked like an oversized frame. It wasn't a painting. It was something larger than a painting allows, a panel that occupied the entire wall like a condemned window. I drew closer and saw it wasn't canvas, nor wood. It was paper glued in layers, maps, clippings, fragments of letters, drafts from leather-bound notebooks. Everything overlapped and pasted with some old glue, hardened into veins and reliefs as if the wall were covered in the hide of a docile animal. And over those layers, at several points, Her handwriting. Small islands of letters stitched together the borders of these papers, creating a geography of intentions. There were dates. There were names. There was my name so many times that I couldn't help lowering my eyes, as if before an altar where I was both offering and executioner. At the center of that monumental collage, a mended photograph. The two of us, younger, in front of the mansion's garden. The sky that day was the promise of a summer without storms. A corner was missing, and the void of that angle had been filled with a graphite drawing that imitated her face with a precision that hurt. The drawing was truer than the photograph. Beneath the photograph, a short sentence crossed over more than once as if to keep the idea from escaping. Love continues to exist even when the body that sustains it is taken away. It wasn't signed, but it was hers. The script carried the urgency of phrases that can't wait any longer. To the left of the panel, a table with objects aligned in an order that would make sense only to the one who chose them. A chipped goblet, a napkin ringed with dried wine, a bunch of keys that opened nothing practical, and an envelope sealed with old wax. Wax I recognized by tone and symbol. Her initial set inside a knot. There, the past wasn't a memory. It was a system. I took the envelope, and as I broke the seal, the room's air seemed to draw close to my face. Curious, almost cordial. Inside, a single sheet, and on it, a simple confession that fell on me like a stone. I hid you from here because it was the only way to keep you. The sentence was accompanied by a tiny drawing, the outline of the mansion seen from above, with a dot marked exactly where I stood. The arrow read, "Shielded room." Shielded against what? Against whom? When I raised my head, I noticed a new detail. The chair S shadow on the floor didn't match the chair S real position. It was slightly ahead, as if some invisible light behind me were pushing it. I turned reflexively, and there was no source. Only the vague sensation that something was watching without eyes and breathing without lungs, like a habit of the house. The knocks that had brought me there ceased. In their place, the sound of pages being turned without hands. From where did it come? The table didn't move. The panel didn't shift. The sound seemed to rise from the very fabric of the walls, as if the layers of maps and letters needed to rearrange themselves to make room for the next revelation. I pressed my ear to the pasted surface. I felt a low vibration, almost indistinguishable, like the purr of a satisfied memory. There are those who say there is no presence without a body. I no longer believe that. The house offered me the opposite, a body made of presences. The effect, however, wasn't panic. It was tenderness. There was tenderness in that rigorous method, in that organization of losses. And it was this tenderness that struck me when I found, in a lower corner of the panel, a small folded paper pinned in place. When I unfolded it, her handwriting returned her voice to me like a recognized breeze. "If you've come this far, it's because you couldn't bear not to see me. I couldn't bear it either. So I made a place where we would still see each other after." The sentence wasn't a metaphor. Below it, a second sheet showed a drawing of the panel with an indication, "Behind." I ran my hand along the edges until I felt a rise. I pressed, and the wall gave by a centimeter, revealing a simple mechanism. The entire collage was a lid. Carefully, I shifted it aside. Behind it, a mirror, and there was the impossible portrait I thought I'd glimpsed upon entering. The two of us painted without brush, as if someone had laid upon the mirror's silver the colors that do not exist, the tones only memory knows how to make. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a painting. It was a reflection refusing to obey the present. Her hand on my shoulder, my face leaning toward hers. The sensation was brutal and sweet. I existed there as nowhere else in the world. I knelt, not out of reverence, but because my legs understood before I did what had been lost. I touched the surface, and the silver accepted my gesture with the delicacy of a lake. The image rippled, and for an instant my reflection and hers blended, as if the mirror were a skin between two consciousnesses that still knew how to speak without words. The touch returned a faint warmth. It wasn't physics. It was fate. Behind me, a dry sound. The short key, The one tied to the ribbon shifted by itself across the table and fell, as if someone had pushed it. To remind me of a responsibility, I picked it up without looking and slipped it into my pocket. The mirror then revealed a detail I hadn't noticed before. In the portrait, my right wrist bore a pale mark, an old cut, one I didn't have in real life. Yet it took only a moment of staring before a faint burning began on my skin, as though the image were teaching me a scar. And a phrase from the notebook, "There is no secret without a body," returned with the weight of an undeniable truth. Her love had grown here, clandestinely. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a project. A project built on rules, shortcuts, counterweights. The mansion had been prepared to host the impossible and to train it for permanence. I, who had once prided myself on being rational, began to understand that reason, in this house, was a foreign language. The native tongue here was the pact. The signs of vigilance intensified. The wall fabric shifted without stirring dust. The panel sighed. The jasmine petals, once scattered across the floor, now appeared on the table, as though it had rained inside the room. And in the mirror, a subtle change. Her hand, the one resting on my shoulder in the portrait, tightened its grip. Not on my shoulder now, but on the one I had in that image. And I felt it, unmistakably, that familiar warmth. The warmth she gave when asking me to stay. The request was so clear it needed no words. I understood. Don't step away. Then I noticed the final component, invisible until that instant. A faint sound, a song without melody, woven from the ticking of clocks, the rustle of paper, the slow breathing of glass. It was as if the house itself whispered, "Recognize. To recognize is to name, and to name is to accept." My body accepted before my mind could refuse. But there was something I hadn't foreseen. Her method had shadows. Beneath the table, a heavier envelope. I pulled it free. Inside, several unsent letters. Addressed to me, yes, but dated on days I had never lived in this house. Letters from a time when I wasn't there. Written as if I had been. In each one, a version of us. In some we were older, serene, guiding the house like parents leading a child toward sleep. In others, repeated farewells, each one quieter than the last, as if she had practiced the act of leaving until it stopped hurting. But every letter carried the same confession. If I lose you, I lose myself. And clipped to one, a small note that explained everything. That's why I hid what could take you from me. What had she hidden? The question struck with the clarity of a sentence pronounced. In the mirror, our portrait darkened, a shadow forming in the background, the faint outline of something else. Neither her, nor me. A third shape, a contour that resembled a cradle, and the phrase from the nursery, "We do not cradle what was never born," lit up in memory, burning through the air like scripture catching fire. The secret breathed in the room, like a newborn finally crying. My throat dried. There was love in all of this, but also amputation. The romance that sustained us had grown roots in soil that refused to accept the body of what was promised and never came. She had armored the heart of the house because she had armored her own. And in doing so, she sealed my ability to forget. In the mirror, our portrait began to fade, not like a curtain descending, but like a sun learning to set too soon. Her hand loosened from my shoulder, and the silver gave back my real face, aged, marked, skeptical again. Yet something remained, the sting at my wrist that wasn't there, and the certainty of a bond that no instrument could sever. Behind me, the door breathed. The room, satisfied with my silent confession, began to return me to the corridor. I understood. This had been only the first step, the first repayment of shadow. There would be others. Her method had a sequence, and I had just completed scene 1. When I touched the doorknob to leave, the collage panel slowly returned to its place, like an eyelid lowering to protect an eye from the world. And there, a final message, written so small I had to lean my whole life toward it to read. If you love me, do not look in the cellar. Not yet. Not yet. The house, like a trained animal, waited for my next move. I, like someone recovering from a fever that brought clarity, walked down the corridor and found the hall again. The clock aligned, the late afternoon light dimmer, the scent of jasmine and rain intertwined. And for an instant I was consumed by a contradiction. I was closer to her than I had been since she left, and at the same time, further from the innocence that once let me sleep. Love here was a house without a roof, beautiful to behold, dangerous to inhabit. At the center of the hall, something new, a thin trail of water, as though someone had walked through dripping. It led to the back door, the one that opened toward the garden that once had been whole. Thunder rolled, polite and deliberate, like a guest announcing its arrival, and on the first stone step, a fresh petal. I stepped outside. The garden wasn't dead. It was suspended like the gardens in paintings where spring and morning learn to coexist. The wind moved the leaves with the exact measure of a happy memory. And there, facing the line of trees, I finally understood what had been watching me all along. It wasn't the portraits. It was the house itself. It watched me, not as a jailer, but as someone afraid of losing again what had barely been recovered. Her care had become the house's vigilance. I was both guest and reason. The water trail ended beside the old well. The pulley hung motionless. The bucket suspended a hand's width above the rim, as if someone had left it there between one thought and the next. On the stone, carved with the delicacy of a wound meant to last, her initial, the same symbol as the wax seal. I touched the bucket, cold, but clean. When I pulled it up, something dark clung to the bottom, tied by a thread. A small metal box. I opened it. Inside, a ribbon like the one that held the key, and atop it a fragment of photograph, the missing corner from the central portrait in the panel. In it, the cradle's shadow, clear as confession. And over that shadow, two initials I had never seen together before. Hers, and another, smaller one. Not mine. The world tilted a degree. The house sighed, the clock inside stumbled over a beat. And a certainty, sharp, merciless, took shape. The secret she had kept to preserve me was not only about me. It was about a third love, a promise of a body that never reached the world, or that had been taken from it, so I would never leave. I didn't yet know what was more terrible, the idea that this love had died, or the possibility that, blinded by devotion, I had never even realized it had lived. A sound rose from the well, brief, like a stifled sob. No wind to carry it. Yet its echo seemed to choose my bones as its chamber. The water below didn't churn violently. It only rippled. Obedient. As if an invisible hand had touched its surface with the tenderness reserved for a fevered brow. I looked toward her window. The curtain's slow ballet was an invitation, not to the eyes, but to memory. It waved with the dignity of old rituals, calling someone by the name that exists only inside a house. I put the small metal box in my pocket beside the ribbon. The weight felt like a decision. The suspended garden breathed like a patient fighting to keep air. And the sky finally released the first drop of rain, so large it seemed to hold a piece of the entire afternoon inside it. I went back in. The scent of new rain met the jasmine and for an instant created a new perfume. Almost bearable, almost joyful. But joy here was a word that could never arrive whole. The staircase greeted me with a brief groan, not a warning, but consent. I was no longer the intruder. I was the convalescent, returning to his bed. I climbed carefully, like someone walking across a fragile memory. At the landing, the corridor seemed smaller, as though the architecture itself had adjusted to the pace of my heartbeat. The bedroom door stood ajar. The curtain's fabric traced on the floor the outline of an ancient tide. The jasmine scent had softened under the rain's humidity, and the dust had risen, thickening the air to something almost solid. I entered without announcing myself to anyone but the clock. The mirror still slept beneath its cloth, but a crease in the fabric showed that someone, or something, had touched it recently. On the nightstand, where nothing had been before, lay another ribbon, like the one from the well, but clean, without rust, as if freshly drawn from a drawer that smelled of soap and lavender. I knelt to look closer. In the fold of the bow, a single strand of hair, not white, a child's hair, so light it almost had no color. Memory is not chronological. It folds over itself, like a bird preening its feathers before flight. And there in that room a fold opened. It came as a moment from a distant winter, the fire burning, the window glass hinting at frost. Her lying there, one hand on her belly, her gaze fixed on a point that wasn't in the ceiling, nor in the world. I was beside her, trying to learn how to be present where a body did not yet have the right to exist, the promise of a name, the residue of a fear. And then, silence. Not the silence of night. The silence of what never became. I returned to the present like surfacing from water whose temperature never changes. The rain outside grew heavier, beating on the roof with a liturgical rhythm. The hall clock counted without hurry a full minute, and I knew time had decided to cooperate. On the dresser, our portrait, the one I had left leaning, now tilted slightly, showing a fractured reflection of the hallway. An invitation not to avoid what already watched me anyway. I ran my fingers over the mirror's wooden frame. The cloth responded, like skin. I lifted it gently, expecting my reflection to return the austere brutality of reality. Instead, I saw us both again, me and her. But something had changed. In the background, the outline of the cradle, sharper now, and upon it rested something that wasn't object, wasn't person, but weight. The mirror's silver trembled, not from my hands, but because the house could no longer bear so much secret without body. The note's phrase, "There is no secret without a body," manifested on my skin, thickening the air around me. Rain streamed down the gutters like a liquid rosary. Somewhere a leak began dripping into an old basin, each drop telling a version of the same story. The mansion waited, patient, for me to understand without asking. When I looked away from the mirror, I noticed a faint trail on the floor, not of petals but of displaced dust, as if delicate feet had recently walked there. The trail led to the corridor's end where the boards sagged slightly, revealing a small hatch I had never seen before. Not the cellar, not yet. The ceiling, a passage to the attic. The notebook's instructions had said little about the upper part of the house. Silence in that case was its own warning. Yet the body obeyed the body, not prudence. I pushed open the little hatch, and a folding ladder descended, coughing dust and memory in equal measure. The darkness above had a different scent, less house, more time. The air carried traces of stored fabric, unread books, and metal learning to die slowly. I climbed with the calm of one accepting a sacrament without understanding its creed. The attic wasn't large. The ceiling sloped low, forcing the neck into humility. Trunks stood in a row, some opened by curiosity left unfinished, others sealed, protected by a varnish-thick layer of age-old dust. Light entered through a small oval window, where the rain wrote the same letters that longing inscribes on the face of those who wait. In one corner, a dressmaker's mannequin held a beige dress, bodiless, hanging over emptiness with the patience of a calm widow. I knelt beside the first trunk. The lock yielded with a sound like a syllable. Inside, the trousseau that never reached the world. Delicate fabrics, embroideries crafted with a precision that surpassed their purpose, tiny ribbons made for wrists of a future never summoned. On each piece, a small embroidery. 2 initials, hers and another, the same as the one from the photograph's missing corner in the well, not mine. Those letters, repeated, formed a fragile chorus that passed through me with the grace of a beautifully composed morning. Beneath the layette, a thin notebook unlike the others, better paper, a blue-gray cover, the edges still holding a discreet sheen, as if they hadn't been handled in desperation. I opened it. The first pages were an earthy announcement of hope, notes about weeks, about care, about the vertigo of a body preparing to house another. There was a palanquin of tenderness in the way the words occupied the space. Unhurried, focused, as if each sentence had been written beside an open window. On the next page, an image pasted in. Not a photograph, not a painting. An objective record of a shape still white, the first outline of someone whose weight I would never learn. Someone who already bore the 2 initials. I flipped back a few pages like someone trying to stop a clock. I found a note I hadn't asked for, but that was given to me. He won to know how to carry the weight if I show him the weight. I'll be the one to keep it. I'll be the one to hurt. The handwriting had no guilt, no excuses. It was method. It was. And her method didn't exclude me out of malice. It excluded me out of love. Love that chose a specific kind of night to protect a specific kind of morning that never dawned. At the back of the notebook, a pale envelope, edges lightly singed by the nearness of the fireplace, perhaps on a winter night when the decision needed heat. Inside, a hospital document dry with the rigor only institutions know, dates, numbers, stamps. A field where my name should have appeared was empty. Not crossed out, not erased. Empty from the start, as if the shape of my presence had been acknowledged and still kept outside. So nothing would give way while something gave way within her. Below, a space for a signature. One name was missing, another remained, hers, steady. For the first time since I had entered the house, I felt something like jealousy. Not jealousy of the past, that is foolish, but jealousy of pain. She had chosen to suffer alone. She removed me from the perimeter of loss so I could remain whole. And in doing so, she made me a survivor of something I hadn't known I'd suffered. Her love, in its attempt to keep me, had amputated me from a rightful mourning. The gentle cruelty of that revelation fixed itself in my chest with the precision of a nail set just right to hold a heavy frame. I closed the notebook slowly, and the gesture lifted a bit of dust that fell again like a brief veil over things. When I raised my head, I noticed behind the mannequin with the widow's dress a small door of light wood, almost a hatch. It didn't appear on any floor plan of my memory. The latch was simple, and behind it a narrow stairway descended into the interior of the house's walls. Not the cellar. A vertical corridor, a brick intestine and damp air that probably led to the ribs of the hall. Her instructions had asked, "Not yet." But the house, with the condescension of absolutes, allowed me to go. I went down, and as my feet found invisible steps, the sound of clocks multiplied, as if each wall held its own mechanism, all imperfect, all stubborn. The passage opened into a slit above the library, a tiny internal balcony, a secret pulpit from which one could see the table, the books, the letters. And now, something that hadn't been there before, a vase of fresh flowers. Not jasmine. Lilies, pale, recent. The house has no gardener. The garden was in suspension, and yet fresh flowers. I stayed there for long seconds I cannot count. The certainty of another presence lost its modesty. Not a person, perhaps, but a habit of hers that had learned to persist beyond the body. Or, another hypothesis as terrible as it was useful, someone who had shared her method, someone with access to these inner corridors. The second initial, repeated on the layette, repeated on the photograph fragment, repeated in the margin of the document. A letter that jumped off the page and settled on the edge of my understanding. I returned to the narrow stairs and followed them until I reached a colder landing where the air smelled of iron and earth. A stone door inscribed itself on the wall with the discretion of bones under skin. When I pushed it, a short corridor led finally to a last flight, descending to the cellar. The instructions demanded I not go down. The body asked otherwise. And sometimes, obeying the body is the only way not to lose it. The cellar wasn't wide, but it was founded on the kind of depth that cannot be measured. The beaten earth floor kept ancient ruts, and the walls had shelves of jars that didn't name their contents. In one, jasmine petals dried to translucence. In another, small scraps of cloth folded with useless love. And at the center, a low table upon which rested a dark wooden box, polished by hands that did not want to forget how to touch an altar. I approached with the exact weight of hesitation. The lid, heavier than its size, required both hands. Inside, a set of identical envelopes numbered, written by her on different days, each with an instruction in the corner. Open if... It wasn't blackmail, it was belated care. The last envelope bore, in the corner, the same two initials seen everywhere. Beneath them, a minimal phrase. If he comes down without my consent. I opened it. The page spoke to me like someone accepting the inevitable. If you have reached this point, it is because the house has defeated the hour, and I have lost the delicacy of the secret. There is no traitor. There was a third love, one that lacked enough body to last. I didn't want to tell you because I feared the half that would be left of you afterward. I kept it for myself not out of selfishness, but out of love's stubbornness. I wanted to keep you whole. Forgive my architecture. The box had a false bottom. I lifted it with fingers that no longer obeyed me entirely. There lay a small bracelet of ribbon and metal with the same two initials. It was the proof no house can deny. The object had the temperature of absence. I set it on the table, and the sound it made was so small it seemed an apology. From above, a dry knock ran through the mansion S structure and turned into a tremor in the hanging lamp. Outside, the rain erupted with almost cruel intensity. The cellar returned a scent of washed earth, and for a few seconds the only thing I heard inside me was the vastness of what could not be. That was when I noticed the marks on the floor beside the table. Not recent, but not from the time of construction either. Tracks of a piece of furniture dragged along, the exact measure of a cradle. The ruts led to a wall where the plaster had a slightly different color. I touched it. The section gave way, revealing inside what I had not chosen. A small cavity, lined with fabric. Empty. Very clean. Too clean. Her secret hadn't betrayed me. It had been a way to protect me from the most cutting part of love. Even so, knowing hurt with the elegance of an ancient dagger, the kind that doesn't need haste to do what it promises, I closed the false bottom, replaced the box, and remained there, as if awaiting a rite that required a word we don't possess. It was the house that spoke, not with a voice, but with the clocks. All of them, at once, struck a common hour, for the first time since my arrival. And in that united chorus I heard the announcement that shifts the axis of a life. Light rose through a crack in the cellar, and the lamp stopped trembling. The mansion, after years, was whole within a single minute. Something at last had allowed itself to coincide. The doubled shadow hovered like a premature conclusion. Two pairs of feet cut out in the brightness filtering the dust. One with the outline I would recognize in the densest of nights, the other too small to be mine, and yet sharp enough to pierce reason. I stayed still, gathered in the cellar like an unspoken thought. The house held its breath, and the chorus of clocks, which moments ago had converged in unison, dispersed again, each returning to its own delay, as if the earlier coincidence had been merely an exceptional indulgence granted to my understanding. I climbed slowly, through the same narrow corridor between the mansion's ribs, feeling the damp brick shed small grains into my palm. The secret access returned me to the inner balcony, the silent tribune over the library. Below, the jar of lilies seemed to have been touched, the stems altered by meticulous fingers. There was a new dampness on the floor, A perfect half-moon like the mark left by a bucket just set down. The seat of the armchair kept a warm hollow, the elastic memory of a body's recent weight. No voices, no footsteps, only the insistence of the obvious. Someone shared the method, or the method had finally learned to simulate presence with cruel precision. I went down to the library from the outside, circling the room to inspect the trace without smearing it. The central table now held an edition, a gray-covered book, the kind that draws you not by beauty, but by craft. Records. The first turn of a page replaced touch with the electricity of recognition. Aligned dates, times, brief observations about the house, the weather, the garden. It wasn't her handwriting. The script had technical firmness, closed loops, straight stems, none of the loving hesitations I recognize in every gesture she ever set on paper. In the upper corner of the first sheet, the initials that had been stalking my lucidity since the well. The same as in the layette, the same as on the bracelet in the cellar. The second letter was finally beginning to gain the muscle of a person. I turned pages with the care reserved for someone else's memories. The notes described the house like a body under treatment. Hall clock oscillation, 5:03 p.m., corrected by opening the back bedroom window. Water entry through the ceiling seam above the library, contain with folded cloths and remove before dawn. Place lilies when the jasmine feels heavy. Reinforce attic interior latches before heavy rain. In several entries, my name appeared as the axis of a delicate operation. Prepare surfaces for his recognition. Move mirrors away on low-light days. Never allow him to go down to the cellar before the clocks coincide. Not an enemy, a companion in crime. And a companion to whom? The answer was partly already there, to an interrupted promise, to a love that had to learn to survive in pieces. The house, in that choreography of effective maintenance, was almost a clinic of absence, and that second initial, multiplied like a mantra, revealed the name of the one who had helped sustain the method on the days when my body was prescribed for mourning. Not my substitute. The word substitute would be far too small. Someone placed between life and memory to make sure neither was lost entirely. The ledger advanced to dates that pressed up against the present. Among the notes, one stood out, underlined not with ink, but with pressure. Today, prepare the bedroom mirror so he can see himself in what remains. The date was the day of my return. The house hadn't received me by chance, it had been prepared. One last line, almost secret in the margin. If he goes down without my warning, do not stop him. The house will know what to show. The my warning was not hers. It belonged to one who had learned to speak for the house. The table offered another object with the gentleness of water proffered to a convalescent. A ring. Not a wedding band. A thin circle, more promise than pact. Inside, engraved, the two initials. Neither was mine. I held that light metal like a wounded bird I wasn't sure I should quiet. The ring wouldn't fit my finger. It had never been made for my hand. And yet it weighed upon it like a sentence. To the left of the library, the long corridor returned the twilight's penumbra. Along the baseboard, a thin line of displaced dust traced the step of recent feet. I followed it, accepting the floorboard's creak as one listens to stray music coming from the next room. The trail stopped before a door that, until then, had been merely an incurious section of wall. The jamb showed wood worn by the habit of opening at the same point, and the knob, smooth, held the gloss of passing days. I pushed. The revealed space was a small room, a laboratory of griefs, cabinets with labeled drawers, a long table with empty vials, a wooden box lined in cloth, and atop it what looked like a ledger. The window was closed, but a desk lamp burned with obedient yellow. When I opened the ledger, chance was dismissed. Names, suppliers, dates, items of care, flowers, candles, oil, cloth, paint, glass. Beside each item, practical notes that poetry rarely accepts but love, in its maturity, learns to collect. On several lines, an address that did not belong to the mansion, a house in town, always tied to the second initial. The method had a base beyond the house's borders. Someone crossed the bridge between the world and the sanctuary often enough to keep absence from rotting. I stopped, not from fear but from reverence. The revelation didn't hurt by itself. It hurt because of the honest way it delivered itself. I lifted my eyes and noticed on the wall opposite the table a set of glassless frames. Inside them, unprotected, were paper clippings with her notes. Originals, not copies. The hand that took them from the notebook and pinned them there knew where to touch without tearing, where to press without leaving oil. It wasn't my hand. She would have recognized the texture of that care, and for an instant I felt the strange peace of knowing that, in my absence, someone had loved what I love as if it were theirs. On the floor, leaning against the baseboard, a low object covered in cloth. When I pulled the fabric, the room's air shifted like the surface of a lake. A disassembled cradle rested there with simple dignity and burned into the wood, the same pair of initials. It was the same cradle whose grooves downstairs had marked the cellar floor. What had been removed from a place of shadow now rested in a room with sufficient light. The hands that moved it knew the house's liturgy. The window asked for a gesture and I obeyed. From outside the pane returned the shard of a broken afternoon, and the rain, reduced to a constant thread, made a fine music vibrate along the sill. Behind me, the desk lamp gave a faint snap and blinked, as if invited to share in the hesitation. The ring in my right hand seemed to gain weight. The second initial, repeated ad nauseum, ceased to be a mere sign and took on the plea of a full name, one my mind still refused to pronounce, out of modesty maybe, or self-preservation. The corridor called me back with the power certain doors have to exile us from recent comfort. The house knew the rhythm and imposed the step. The hall opened like a mouth that feeds on returns, and the clock, the largest, the unjust, struck a single blow that reverberated up to the roof. Then the sound of water, not rain but of a cloth being wrung out. Near, intimate, domestic. I went to meet the noise as if seeking a prayer. In the kitchen, presence was the sum of evidence. A damp kettle rested on the old stove, a slightly crumpled napkin bore the geometry of recent use, and the sink showed the thin line of water gravity draws when someone pauses a gesture and resumes it moments later. On the table, a mug whose steam wasn't visible, but whose warmth still clung to the ceramic. The method had a possible face, though its eyes were denied me. Then I found something that, more than any other sign, determined the texture of the discovery. A folder with elastic bands, the kind that opens like a disciplined mouth. Inside, letters. Some were copies of those I'd seen in the cellar. Others existed nowhere else. Many were addressed to me, but none had been sent. The difference was that these bore, at the footer, the signature of the second initial. They were letters written to keep someone else's language alive. The content was a careful record of the house's everyday during my absence. Seasons endured small victories against mold nights when the clock yielded a whole-hour days, when the jasmine sweetened the air too much and had to be replaced with lilies. In brief lines, the shadow of an old agreement appeared, forged between her and this someone. A pact of effective maintenance. A house does not sustain itself. Love needs hands, the hands that sustained. This realization awoke in me a late jealousy, less possessive than orphaned, not of her body, but of the right to suffer in real time. While I was spared, someone carried with me the weight that was mine, without my name on the signature line. And the petals that guided me, the letters that oriented me, the mirror that returned my face to me even when I didn't know what I was seeking, all of it had been maintained by a pair of initials I still hesitated to pronounce, perhaps for fear of profaning a silent ethic. I set the folder down with the reverence of someone returning a belonging to an altar. I went back to the hall. The light had finally fallen, and the stained glass returned to the house, that color of still water that precedes decisions. That was when the air shifted on the upper landing and the floorboards, with biographies of their own, registered a restrained step. The step of someone who knows the zones of silence. My body, more than my will, moved forward. I climbed the stairs with my eyes on the shadows, The corridor held the sound as if it were a throat made for oaths. The door to her room was open now, at a mathematical angle that obeyed no wind. The cloth had fallen from the mirror, and the silver returned a scene in which my body both was and was not there at the same time. On the vanity, beside our portrait, another photograph, one that hadn't been there before, rested with a cruel modesty. It was an old image, taken in a summer before our last attempt to remain. She appeared seated in the garden, her head inclined over a notebook. Beside her, someone. The face slightly in profile wasn't fully visible to me, but the gesture, the posture of someone holding up a world with both hands, was the same one I had recognized in the letters and the ledgers and the lilacs that appeared from nowhere. The second initial, at last, ceased to be a hieroglyph. The house closed the windows from within with a simple snap. The wind fell silent, and in the mirror, behind my shoulder, a contour organized itself into a person, not as an apparition, but as a conclusion. No words, no outstretched arms, only presence whole in the same piece of air. The method embodied. The two initials were not a supernatural riddle after all. They were the discreet name of someone who loved her when I could not, and who loved our memory when I was spared from it. The world slipped a gear. At the impact of understanding, something inside me broke and at the same time locked into place. Truth was neither a bullet nor a flower. It was a missing piece that allowed the time machine of that house to function again. There, before the mirror where past and present refused a border, I perceived the outline of the turning point that would expel me from the comfort of the spared victim's role and summon me to the real place, the one who chooses knowing. The present stepped aside, granting me passage. The house, docile, widened the corridor. The hall clock readied its gears for a new alignment, and the mirror, obedient to the right, returned us, for a second, not as rivals in the same story, but as two guardians of a love that, despite everything, did not succumb to rot. Understanding didn't save me, but it offered ground. And upon that ground, I saw the house ready for the next scene, the one that does not allow distracted witnesses. The door that had whispered prohibitions for so long opened with an obedience that wasn't defeat, but right. The air from the stairs to the cellar rose like the memory of an old embrace, cold and yet intimate. The hall clock delivered the perfect coincidence of the hours, and that rare precision settled a different gravity over the house, as if the entire structure accepted a verdict. I descended the first step knowing the descent was not only vertical, it was also a curve within the body, a fold where memory learns to speak truths that have hibernated for years with their eyes open. The narrow corridor returned the sound of my steps in measured volumes, as if someone were adjusting crank and pressure on a gramophone of bones. The cellar floor awaited, with its alphabet of earth and ruts, and the lamp held steady, without the tremor that once betrayed hesitation. On the low table, the box of envelopes recognized me like a house pet lifting its head at the sound of its master. The bracelet with the two initials remained where I had left it, so light it seemed at risk of evaporating. There was, however, another change. Beside it lay an object that hadn't been there before. A folded ribbon, clean, the same color as the layette kept in the attic. On the ribbon, a pin fastened to a small rectangle of paper with the concise clarity of decisions. The second initial, drawn with patience and courage. The presence from upstairs descended with an old-fashioned modesty. There was no startle, no new cold, only the certainty that the method had at last chosen to incarnate without fear of confusing the sacred with the necessary. The footsteps stopped at a ceremonial distance, as if respecting an invisible circle traced on the floor. I felt it, and without seeing the face in full, recognized the outline I'd already read in the letters, in the ledgers, in the lilacs that appeared from a garden suspended by will. The house, demure, introduced us with the delicacy of a temple that understands the danger of haste. The body of that other presence was a sum of contained gestures, not an intruder, not an heir, not a rival. The guardian who held the place while the original love became liturgy. A hand rested on the box lid with the competence of someone who repeats a craft learned in silence. The lamp did not waver. My lungs obeyed. There was peace in that recognition, a peace that does not beg leave of pain, only includes it. The turning point began as great changes begin, not with trumpets but with details. The bracelet was lifted with a devout gesture and set against the clean ribbon, as if together they formed for the first time the outline of a word. The second initial shone with the modesty of that which does not wish to humiliate anyone. The cellar floor returned a scent of washed iron, and the wall, at the spot where the fabric-lined niche had once been concealed, answered with a brief click, a kind of pivot finding its true seat. The house celebrated without noise. On the table, a numbered envelope I had not opened waited for my hands. Not the last, not the first, one from the middle, as if the narrative itself had decided it was time to read by the order of feelings, not of days. I loosened the seal and found a page written in that hand I could recognize even under snow. Instructions not to avoid, but to cross. It spoke of 3 gestures that, performed in sequence, would allow the house to transform absence into a bearable form. 1 gesture from above, 1 from the middle, 1 from below. The attic, the library, the cellar. I had already, unknowingly, fulfilled the first 2. Open the blue-gray notebook, face the mirror and accept the impure reflection. The last remained. Return the bracelet to the world by the path it had chosen to declare it existed. The presence beside me agreed without sound. The hand pointed toward the well by direction of the gesture long before the body moved. The method asked for water, and water, like all things that know how to work with weight, asked for respect. We went up together, each carrying a part that cannot be weighed on scales. The hall received the silent procession without rejoicing. The house did not celebrate. The house concentrated. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving in the air that aggressive transparency that announces the moment after pain, when everything appears outlined with exaggerated clarity. In the yard, the well remained with the dignity of an ancient mouth. The pulley groaned like an old tooth, and the rope, as it was pulled, returned the certainty that simple mechanisms are the most faithful. The bucket emerged with ritual slowness. On the stone once more her initial burned in, mingled with lichen and time. I returned the bracelet to the bucket, not as one discards, but as one presents. The other hand, the one that had sustained the years of maintenance, offered the ribbon. It laid it upon the water with a delicacy that felt like liturgy. The ribbon floated for a bodily second, absorbed part of the moisture, and curving, formed a bow neither of us had made with our fingers. The house again announced its presence. Then on the dark surface of the well appeared the image that for an instant disorganized the health of my heart. The reflection of 3, not 2. Me, the companion presence, and, between us, a small outline, a void with form. Not a ghost, not an illusion. The body the secret had tried to deny the world, transformed into delicate evidence. No hands, no voice. Only a new weight in the air, small, exact, decisive, like the instant a word finds its first correct syllable. Until then, the past had served us as a house. From that image onward, it became choice. The turning point did not lie in discovering that the third love had existed, that I already knew. It lay in accepting that its permanence depended on a pact that now included me. I, who had been spared pain in order to remain whole, would have to consent to lose the half that had kept me functional all these years. The house did not want grand answers. It wanted the weight of consent. The presence beside me understood with me. The next gesture was so simple that in any other setting it would have seemed domestic. Both hands joined on the well, lip, eyes open to the depth, silence offered whole to what must be received. The hall clock struck a single, dry blow and then listened. The rope yielded a hand's breadth, as if someone very light had grabbed it to play. A breath of jasmine mingled with the odor of wet stone, and for a second, the seasons seemed to coexist without quarrel. The bracelet, now dark with water, touched the ribbon, and in that touch revealed writing that dryness had hidden. Inside the metal, beyond the 2 initials, there was a third letter, almost erased, that was neither mine nor the guardian's. The letter of someone who had begun to be in the world and had not completed the grammar. Not a full name. A promise with form. A promise is not fulfilled. A promise is sustained. There lay the minimal form of what I must accept as fate. The path back to the library did not feel like a return, but an advance. The light traced the edges of the furniture as if to confirm reality. Everything here belonged to the same house. On the table, the folder of letters waited as confessionals wait after an afternoon of storm, emptied and ready. The present set the record book beside the folder, aligning their spines with a precision that wasn't fussiness. It was respect. I, not knowing to which altar to offer what I carried in my pockets, opened our portrait and placed the missing fragment alongside it. The cradle appeared whole in the image, and a shred of sun returned to the paper, the benign illusion of a summer without tragedy. The house seemed to sigh, not relief, assent. The corridor leading to the bedroom expanded by a centimeter, as seams do when a body breathes. The uncovered mirror returned a face I did not know. Mine, without a shell I had mistaken for skin. There was no heroism, only the expression of someone finally admitted into the work of keeping what he loves, including when what he loves could not remain. The presence behind me became a light shadow, not to vanish, but so as not to obstruct the new axis forming. The turning point then finished settling in. The house ceased to be a mausoleum and became a workshop. The secret she had kept to keep me whole revealed itself as a machine of love that could, yes, finish me, not by destruction, but by transformation. The risk now was chosen. I could accept the final right, the one that, according to the instructions, would bind memory and body in the house once and for all, at the price of carrying forever the exact weight of what was missing. No longer spared, no longer protected. Full, as only the wounded who acknowledge themselves can be. Dusk laid itself over the stained glass with the serenity of inevitable things. The sound of the suspended garden came through the window like a blessing that needs no religion. The presence gathered the ribbon, stretched it along the table, and with the calm of one who performs rites without asking for applause, laid the bracelet across it. The symbol was made. All that was missing was the body that would accept the task. There was no imposition. There was belonging. I pointed the way back to the cellar with a heart in a state of prayer. The house did not move. It merely opened a path. The stairs this time did not creak. The floor this time did not weigh. The lamp this time did not tremble. On the table, the envelopes, now empty, looked like miniature doors that had finished their work. On the wall, the newly seated plaster breathed with me. The clock upstairs arranged its gears for the day as third coincidence, the one that occurs only when a story changes register. I understood at last the outline of what was to come. There would be a rite beneath the house, a final gesture that would seal her pact with the guardian presence and, by extension, with me. There would be offering. There would be chosen loss. Above all, there would be the chance for love to stop hiding in methods and survive in a body, even if that body were mine, forever crossed by the memory of one who did not fit into the world. The page freed itself like an animal that finally accepts the collar. The paper had the calming weight of inevitable things. I laid it on the table beside the emptied envelopes, and the cellar adjusted its breathing, as if opening space within its lung for the entrance of deeper air. Her script wasn't dramatic. It was technical, almost medical, as befits gestures that do not depend on will to be necessary. The rite asked for 3 movements in the body of the house, and a 4th movement in the body of the survivor, an alignment between the above, the middle, and the below, followed by the giving of a visible sign that could sustain the invisible without demanding miracles. The first movement had already been fulfilled in the attic, to recognize the unused layette, the incomplete name, the grammar that never concluded. The second belonged to the library, to adjust the mirror and return the missing fragment to the portrait so the image could sustain presence without collapsing. The third now summoned me, to carry to the well, at the hour when the house coincided, the bracelet and the ribbon, and return them to the water with the care of one who baptizes without baptism. The 4th gesture, the costliest, depended on me alone, to accept a mark. Not a deep cut, not a theatrical wound, but a discreet inscription on the wrist, the same one the mirror had hinted at in my reflection, so that the secret might at last have a body in me as well, and not only in the furniture, the papers, and the architecture. The guardian presence S-body understood without a word, and moved with the natural ease of someone who has already memorized the path in the dark. We went upstairs. The corridor returned the sound of our steps with a quiet dignity. The hall lay in a twilight that seemed undecided between dying and being born. The clock, attentive, awaited the next coincidence, as if the day, out of rare generosity, were willing to grant us one more alignment. We went to the yard. The well received us with the placidity of places that have learned to be an altar. The pulley turned obedient, and when the water revealed its surface, it carried the inverted image of the mansion's stained glass like a submerged blessing. I set the ribbon upon the dark mirror, and it settled with the modesty of an ancient gesture. I laid the bracelet on top, and in that instant the water seemed to rise a millimeter, as if the house also possessed a tide. The guardian presence lifted a clean cloth, not white, but almost, and stretched it between the stone rim and my hands. It was a practical detail, a kindness for the skin, and at the same time, a way of saying that liturgy admits tenderness without losing composure. The third coincidence of the hours descended through the mansion like a liquid truth. The clock struck, and the blow was given entirely to the water, which quivered without spilling. The surface returned the outline that had made us a possible family. Me, the presence, and the small form. And around that outline, a colorless glow, like the light of mornings prior to vocabulary. The rituals page asked that at the end I retrieved the objects. I obeyed. The bracelet came back to the cloth, the ribbon coiled docilely around it, and the set, now heavier with consent, seemed to fit my hand better. In the library, the mirror waited with its silver still. The portrait, reassembled by the missing fragment, now held our figuration with a balance it hadn't had before. There was less noise in the room, less competition among the clocks. The ledger beside the folder had a blank line that seemed to ask for the next gesture. I didn't write. The house had learned to read without paper, and I, who had always needed ink to prove my understanding, understood that here it was enough to be whole. One movement remained, the one that required a body. I returned to the cellar carrying the cloth. The presence accompanied me to the first shadow of the steps and from there remained, not out of discretion but precision. There are tasks that lose meaning if shared. The lamp did not tremble. The table was the right height. The ritual S page mentioned a specific object I already knew. A pin with a dull head, the same that would fasten the ribbon if there were clothing in the world to receive it. I took it. It had the exact weight of a verb in the imperative. The mark asked for no theatrics, it asked for assent. I took my wrist and for an instant saw the version of myself the mirror had shown, skin scored by a scar I didn't remember having. The pin entered with the precision of an instrument finding a seam. It was not great pain. It was the exactness necessary for the skin to understand the message. A drop formed, round, without vanity. I pressed the ribbon to it and at the touch perceived something the house already knew. Memory is fabric too. It absorbs, it stains, and then returns the right tone to what must remain visible. The bracelet rested upon the bow and the combination, so light, seemed to weigh a century. The body accepted. The cellar altered its scent. Less iron, more earth after rain. The plaster in the niche breathed with me, and the old ruts in the floor canceled the nostalgia of being mere traces. Now they were part of the design. The presence above moved just enough for the floorboards to answer with a brief crack. The house, with the patience of the living who age, adjusted its balance. For the fourth time that day, a coincidence of the hours struck, almost inaudible, as if the mechanism itself understood the delicacy of the moment. The ascent was reverent. The hall now held a frank light, free of tricks. The stained glass returned to the floor a map that taught in colors how to walk without hurting the soles of one's feet. In the bedroom, the mirror received my face with a new degree of familiarity, as if it finally recognized me as part of the method, not a mere visitor to other people's mourning. The mark on my wrist burned like freshly written memory, not like a wound. The portrait behind me sustained the presence with less effort, as if part of the labor of remembrance had finally migrated to where it should, to a breathing body. The presence drew near without reducing the necessary distance. The outline in the mirror confirmed each one's place. The thin ring, the one that wasn't mine to wear, now lay beside the ledger, as if awaiting a gesture that would not be mine. And I understood the last aspect of the turning point. Her secret had been an architecture to keep me whole. The revelation now required me to choose wholeness, even knowing it would keep me vulnerable. There was no revenge to take against the presence who had guarded the house. There was gratitude. There was no guilt to charge the one who had spared me. There was recognition. Love here refused vulgar division. It was a system. The house proved its own truth. In the garden, the wind returned, not to erase anything, but to dry what needed air. In the kitchen, the kettle, silent, kept the possibility of heat. In the library, the flowers, which were lilies, accepted living alongside jasmine without excess sugar. In the cellar, the lamp stayed lit without humiliating the shadow. The method did not ask for miracles, it asked for maintenance. It was the end of the second act by the only road worthy of difficult loves, the one where mystery, before consent, abandons theatricality and agrees to become practice. There were still risks, and the greatest of them awaited me ahead. The rite, complete, did not replace the confrontation. It prepared it. The climax would lie in returning to the center of the labyrinth with a marked body, to hear, in the exact timbre, what she had always tried to say with the entire house. That love was indeed capable of ending me, but only so that something better than I could survive. I closed my eyes for an instant that belonged to me. My wrist, still warm, seemed to align its rhythm with that of the clocks, and the clocks granted me the courtesy of keeping pace. In that brief balance, I heard, not with the ears, but with the skin. The house asked me to go down one last time, not to follow instructions, but to recognize, without instruction, the heart of the secret. The path opened like a certainty learned late. Twilight stretched over the mansion with the elegance of well-kept letters. The presence remained at the threshold between the library and the hall, guarding the interval that separates and sustains. There was tenderness in the air, a tenderness without haunting that needs no proof to exist. And still, fear, the discreet brother of responsibility, placed its hand upon my invisible shoulder. I breathed like someone entering the water for the second time. I went down. The page turned with the slowness of a wet veil, revealing a script that seemed written by the light of a tired candle. The paper exhaled a scent of burnt jasmine, an impossible mixture of flour and ash. The letters, crooked from haste or emotion, trembled as if time had tried to erase them and given up halfway. I read slowly, letting the words settle in the body before reaching the mind. Everything I hid was not to deceive you. It was to give you time. Love, when it doesn't fit, must be postponed. Now it awaits you whole in the place where the heart of the house beats. The final sentence was underlined, and beside it, a fingerprint. Perhaps hers, perhaps mine, perhaps both. Crossing time as if the paper were skin. The heart of the house. The center. The origin of the pulsing that, since my arrival, seemed to breathe with me. The lamp's light wavered for the first time since the rite, casting shadows that danced like water's reflections. The wall seemed damp, alive. The house breathed harder, and for the first time I perceived a sound that did not come from the clocks. A subterranean rhythm, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. Too low for the ear, yet enough for the chest to recognize. The heart of the house. I moved forward. I crossed the cellar like someone walking inside his own body. Each step sounded like a second being counted in another dimension. The old plaster began to crack, revealing a design I had never seen before. Intertwined lines forming the outline of something like veins, a secret map engraved on the wall. At its center, a perfect circle, stained within by a nearly vanished red. The beating came from there. I touched the circle, and the cold crossed the skin like a mineral shiver. The sound intensified, slow, grave, almost a lament. The wall withdrew, only a hand's breadth, and a mechanism that didn't seem made by human hands activated. The floor vibrated, the earth shifted, and the cellar revealed a step that descended even deeper, a sub-basement within the basement, the place she never named, but that had always, somehow, existed between her words. I descended. The lamp above went out, but a weak red light pulsing bled from the walls as if the house had opened its own arteries. The air was warm, dense, full of moisture and memory. There was no smell of mold or rust, only jasmine, now mixed with something metallic, almost too sweet. The space was circular, small, a stone womb, and at the center rested something covered by white cloth, ancient, intact, like an altar preserved not by time, but by devotion. I drew near. The beats quickened, but I no longer knew whether they came from the house or my chest. I knelt. I touched the cloth. It was warm. For a moment I hesitated. Fear, when pure, is indistinguishable from faith. And at that threshold I understood what she meant by giving me time. She had not hidden only a pain. She had postponed my emotional death, the collapse of all I was before accepting the love that did not complete. The cloth now seemed to breathe. With a single motion I lifted it. Beneath, there was no body. There was form. An imperfect sculpture made of wax, cloth, and small objects. A desperate attempt to give a body to what fate had denied. The face was hers, but younger, as if she had modeled herself to remain beside what had not been born. Upon its chest, fastened by a ribbon identical to the one that now marked my wrist, the bracelet. It was the heart of the house, the symbolic body of all she loved and lost. The sculpture seemed to pulse with the same rhythm that had guided me there. Each beat corresponded to the blood running in my wrist, as if the whole house were fed by that remembrance. The walls, covered in inscriptions I could not decipher, glowed faintly, like exposed nerves. And then I understood. She had never left. Not in the way the living leave. She had dissolved into the house, spread her presence, her awareness, her guilt and her love into every stone, every beam, every clock. She was the house. The secret she kept that could end me was not what I expected. It was not betrayal, nor sin, nor guilt. It was permanence. She had kept me alive so that one day I would accept what she had become. Not a memory, but a living architecture of unfinished love. The floor trembled lightly, as if understanding were a trigger. The wax sculpture melted in silence and the bracelet slid, rolling to my feet. I took it in both hands, and its warmth entered my skin as if returning to the right body. The mark on my wrist burned, not with pain, but with recognition. My blood rose. The heart of the house beat in sync with mine. The sub-basement ceiling began to emit a soft sound, as if ancient voices whispered together. They were not words. They were vibrations. And among them, a gentler, more human frequency, hers. I recognized her timbre not as auditory memory but as absolute presence. She did not speak, but she passed through me, and what she said without needing sound was simple and devastating. Now, remember for us. In that instant, every light in the house came on at once. The entire mansion, from the grand staircase to the garden, flared with a feverish glow, as if it had waited centuries to draw a full breath again. The clocks, at last, struck the same time in unison. Not midnight, not noon, but the exact point between them, when time loses its direction and only existence remains. The sculpture had vanished completely, and the floor was dry. The bracelet throbbed in my hands like an autonomous heart. I looked around. The house seemed younger. The cracks had withdrawn, the air was clean, and the jasmine scent ruled everything. Sweet, almost intoxicating. Her love, contained for so many years, now expanded freely, and I was the vessel. Not the recipient, but the guardian. And guardian, I understood, is a title heavier than any loss. The Undercroft returned me to the stairs with the docility of a river that knows its bed. I climbed slowly, the bracelet fastened at my wrist, and as I advanced, the house came with me. The walls pulsed, the floor breathed, the air turned warm and almost human. When I reached the hall, the guardian presence was waiting. In the eyes, a brightness that mixed relief and grief. There were no words, but the silence between us was enough. I knew what she had done all those years. She had tended the house, the absence, the secret, and now she tended me. The love she had left scattered through walls and dreams had finally found shelter in another body beyond my own. The clock sounded one last time, in perfect measure. And at the exact instant of the final stroke, something changed. The stained glass lit from within, casting 3 silhouettes upon the floor, the same as in the well's reflection. This time clear, complete, at peace. Love, memory, and fate, finally reconciled. The house remained still, and for the first time since I entered, silence was only silence. No more breath in the walls, no heartbeats in the floor, no whispers in the wind. She, at last, was at rest. But the pulse, my pulse, continued to beat at the same rhythm that once was hers. And I understood with tenderness and terror that the secret capable of ending me had fulfilled its purpose. It did not destroy me. It merely made me part of what she had always been. Morning settled over the mansion with an indecisive calm, as if the day needed to ask the past's permission to exist. The white flower on the roof looked like an inverted candle, burning from the bottom up, spilling light where for years only shadow had gathered. The air held the sobriety of hospital corridors after a miracle. No one applauds, but silence learns another grammar. I walked through the house like someone crossing a body that, at last, is cleared for discharge. Rooms that had once breathed like tired lungs now rested with their faces turned to the window. The dust, when lifted in the beams of light, no longer behaved like insurgent memory. It was only dust, overcome by brightness. The hall clock kept its pace with discreet dignity, like an old conductor who knows by ear the exact interval between pain and rest. In her room, the mirror returned what is, not what was. Still, along the silver's edge, an almost imperceptible vibration reminded me that presence doesn't exhaust itself. It merely redistributes. On the vanity, the recomposed portrait held a summer that no longer wounded me. It was an archived summer, a season kept with a devoted librarian's care. The jasmine's perfume, less insistent, spread through the morning in fair notes, without excess. The guardian presence was there, as she had been at every instant, but lighter now, occupying a healthy degree of invisibility. The craft that sustained the house for so many years no longer required the same vigil. Serene maintenance would suffice, the simple discipline of living. The second initial engraved on the ring and repeated in the ledger had ceased to be the ghost of a name. It had become a contained gesture, a signature at the foot of a page destiny, wrote without prior consultation. There was, however, a final movement to fulfill, one that fit no instruction, because it is born only when the house grants its ultimate blessing. Love, once tested, always demands a sacrifice, not the theatrical loss of something flaunted, but the intimate abdication of a privilege. I understood with the exactness only the body understands what was being asked of me: to stop inhabiting the mansion as one who seeks, and from that day forward inhabit it as one who keeps. Between seeking and keeping lies a difference that consumes a life. I moved through the floors in ritual march. In the studio, I touched the canvas that had returned her eyes to me. The dry paint gave back no fever, only a residual warmth like the good memory of a winter when the fire was enough. In the library, I aligned the folder of letters, the gray notebook, the thin ring. I took nothing for myself. True belonging admits no plunder. In the attic, I straightened the widow's dress on the mannequin, clipped a loose thread with care, and kept it in an empty matchbox, not to possess, but to teach the objects the gesture of order. The disassembled cradle remained against the wall, dignified as a church pew between ceremonies. The cellar asked for a farewell without drama. The lamp, obedient, lit with the precision of a very short prayer. The table, free of envelopes, offered the cloth, the ribbon, the bracelet, in an arrangement that no longer sought miracles. I touched the mark on my wrist and it answered, alive but domesticated. I had understood the function, not to wound, but to remember. To remember not as torture, but as a method of gratitude. The house, satisfied, taught me one more lesson in effective architecture: open all the windows. Not as profanation, but as coronation. One by one, the casements yielded, returning to the interior a wind that did not threaten. It breathed. Bathed by morning, the stained glass cast a translucent cartography of colors across the floor. I walked over that map with the reverence of someone stepping onto promised land after years of dreaming it as a mirage. The mansion did not ask me to possess it, it asked me to diffuse it. True houses want to become climate. In the suspended garden, the well kept the water's quiet mirror. The pulley, motionless, looked like an ancient eye chosen to contemplate, not to judge. On the stone, her initial now held a brief glint, as if the moss had decided to retreat 0.5 millimeter. I placed the ribbon in the inner pocket of my coat and left the bracelet high on my chest, fastened beneath buttons. Not to hide it, but to learn to carry it. Love chooses the places of the body with the tact of those who dress others for the cold. Chest, wrist, ribs. The guardian presence kept the proper distance. In her hands, the record book. On her face, the honesty of one who claims no authorship over anything she merely tended. There was no triumph possible there, only a silent apportioning of responsibilities. To her, continuity; to me, remembrance; to the house, breath. Destiny sometimes consents to be shared. Then the last fear, the one confessed not even on a deathbed, rose slowly, like someone waking too late. It was not the fear of losing what remained of her, that no longer fit. It was the fear of surviving well. To survive poorly is a habit. To survive well is a craft. It demands posture, humor, method. The climax did not ask of me cemetery courage. It asked everyday courage. It was the most exacting proof of that love, to accept possible happiness without living it as betrayal. I returned to the hall and stopped before the clock. The hands pointed to a mathematical midpoint, that gentle center where the day suspends its polarities. I touched the glass, and the glass returned the warmth of my finger with the good manners of materials that already know the hand that touches them. At the baseboard, beside the door that once said "not yet," now hung the low-toothed key, tied to the old ribbon. The house had returned it upstairs as one returns a name to its owner. I no longer needed to open. The house was open, but I should, from time to time, lock. There are pains that blossom if exposed all the time. There are tendernesses that ripen in shadow. I crossed the room one last time like someone sealing a pact. In the corridor, the portraits were portraits again, and the arrangement of furniture gave proportion back to space. A simple clarity settled on surfaces, and the dust that remained lay down without any pretense of message. The world had nothing to prove there. Neither did I. There was, yes, one final gesture to fulfill, the humblest of all: to leave. If love wishes to last beyond the theater of suffering, it must learn the way to the door, as well as it learns the way to the bed, the kitchen, the yard. I set my hand on the doorknob, and the wood offered little resistance, as if unwilling to hold me back. Outside, the rusted gate waited with a patience of years. When I pushed it, the sound I heard was not rust. It was right. The metal pronounced a brief syllable, sufficient to consecrate the passage. Out of old courtesy, I looked back. The mansion returned to me a calm face, exhausted by the extraordinary, prepared for the simple. The open windows had learned to resemble eyes that do not demand so much. The roof, with its white flower, kept the inverted candle still burning, as if the days to come depended on that combustion. I did not promise to return. I promised to maintain. To promise to maintain is to promise to return without colonizing. The road to town, which had seemed a corridor of losses, revealed itself a path of service. To bring to those who were accomplices what is their due. To distribute the weight onto shoulders that accepted the task without asking for credit. To share the moral authority of a secret that now belonged less to pain and more to meaning. The world, suddenly, had another scale. The village of ordinary houses, the little market with shy fruit at the door, The church bell 2 minutes late. Everything seemed fit, in its own way, to host the rest of the story. I returned at dusk, not out of dependence, but out of schedule. A house's guardian learns the shifts, morning to air out, afternoon to gather in, night to quiet. On the threshold, the scent of jasmine mixed with firewood, and that ordinary combination steadied my faith better than any vision. I walked to the library, aligned 3 books the wind had displaced, picked up from the floor a stray petal, straightened a frame. In the cellar, I checked the lamp. The light came on like a greeting and then withdrew again, obedient to the hour. I passed my palm over the wall where the vein drawing slept. The heart of the house now beat with mine without asking for applause. The mark on my wrist settled on the leather like a warm seal gone dim, discreet, ready to remain without spectacle. This is how great love stories end, not with an explosion, but with a user manual. Freed from a state of emergency, the mansion at last had simple instructions. And I had a mission that required no heroics. Keep the clocks with sustenance and forgiveness, change flowers when the air grew heavy, accept that some doors will remain closed for months without that meaning abandonment. Clean the mirror when memory tries to turn into idolatry. When night fell, the roof tended the flower as one snuffs a candle carefully after prayer. The guardian presence gathered the objects that were hers, left those that now belonged to us, and, without dramatic gesture, assumed for the first time a rest that was not vigilance. Nothing lacked, nothing was left over. Love, tested, approved in right and in the everyday, breathed. It was in that rare equilibrium that the house, as if it wished to gift the beginning of afterward, let a very soft sound rise from the well, not the brief cry but the murmur of contented water. It was the world readjusting to its proper size. And above, at the bedroom window, the curtain moved with a new humility. It no longer waved. It invited sleep. I lay down in the hall on the old rug, my head turned toward the stained glass. The colored design breathed over my face the exact map of what I would need to remember on the first day without fantasy. That the house was not a tomb, but an organ. That it was not absence, but degree. That I was not a hero, but a caretaker. The body rested like someone returning alone. The pulse, aligned to the mechanics of the hands, crossed the night with the serenity of one who has finally found the rhythm of his task. When I fell asleep, the jasmine on the roof burned no longer, but in the air one could feel the invisible ember of what decides to remain, without asking forgetfulness for permission. The next morning, the light entered without asking leave. It did not come through the window, but through every possible opening, through cracks, through seams in the wood, through fibers of fabric, through intervals between things. It was a patient light, without triumph, as if it had waited years for that right of entry. The house received it with discreet gratitude. No wall resisted. No shadow complained. The sheet left in the library was exactly where it should be, on the central table flanked by a jar of lilies I didn't recall picking. The handwriting, clear and current, belonged to the guardian presence. The message, "Today we begin to open the house to the living," was neither an invitation nor a warning. It was a sharing. After so long sheltering the weight of a remembrance, the mansion was ready to be a dwelling of the world again. I stood before the sentence for long minutes. The sun reflected on the stained glass, and the stain of colors moved slowly over the words, as if blessing them. I understood then what love had made of me. Not a victim, not a penitent, but a link. The last thread tying the past to the present, and the first anchoring the present to what would come after. That was the price and the privilege of being remembrance made flesh. The morning air carried sounds that had not echoed in those walls for a long time. Birds singing in the valley, the crunch of steps on gravel at the gate, wood expanding under heat. The house answered like one waking from too long a dream, reorganizing the body before getting up. I walked the corridors and felt that the floor, once heavy, now received my steps with the lightness of places reconciled to their own story. On the stairs, time's marks remained visible, but they were no longer wounds. They were usage grooves, proof that something had existed, loved and endured. The portraits, dusted, kept their faces in their original position, The eyes of the old figures no longer followed me. They looked forward, as if the past had finally agreed to follow the natural course of things. Her bedroom stayed open. I entered in silence, not from fear but from respect. The mirror, uncovered now, reflected only the room. The made bed, the aligned sheet, the portrait on the vanity. There were no overlays, no tremors, no doubled presences. The house had learned to reflect what exists, not what is missing. On the window ledge, the wind made the curtains dance. They no longer waved. They simply breathed. Outside, the jasmine multiplied into new blooms. Each falling petal seemed to turn into a minute of ordinary life, and the house made of rituals and tragedies began to accustom itself to the simple idea of routine. I went to the library. On the record book, the second initial now sat beside mine, small side by side without ceremony. The guardian presence had understood what I was still trying to articulate. A secret only fulfills its function when it is shared. It is not silence that purifies it. It is testimony. I opened the great room's windows. The wind came in with a nearly musical force, stirring the curtains, lifting forgotten papers, and spreading the scent of living wood. The renewed air brought a new note to the house's perfume as well. Less jasmine, more wet earth, more sun. Love was beginning to smell of life, not memory. I went down to the garden. The well reflected the blue sky and gentle clouds. The white flower on the roof was still there, solitary, but others now sprouted along the eaves, small, unassuming, as if time itself had learned the gesture of multiplication. I set my hand on the cold stone and closed my eyes. I felt the house's heartbeat aligned with mine, but without demand. It was a fraternal echo, not an invasion. The mark on my wrist, once throbbing, was now merely warm. A serene reminder, not a wound. I understood then that the love she had kept, the same one I thought capable of destroying me, had not finished me, but transfigured me. It had made me something different from what I had been, something that cannot be explained in the language of possession or loss. Her love did not consume me. It remade me. And the secret in the end was this. She had kept, inside me, what remained of the world. The mansion, like a body exhaling a last breath before becoming memory, released the smallest sound, the crack of a beam, the creak of a hinge, the soft echo of wind through stained glass. It was the language of ending, but also of beginning. I realized there was nothing left to protect, only to continue. The guardian presence appeared at the garden door, carrying a small lit lantern. The flame danced even in the sun. She nodded, and the gesture was enough to seal the passage. The house was delivered to time, and we, to the duty of living it. Crossing the gate, the scrape of iron sounded lighter than ever. The valley breathed, and the road, now clear, led back to the city. In the memory's invisible rear view, the mansion grew smaller with each step, until it fit entirely within my chest, where it had always been. I walked without hurry, and the wind carried with me the last verse the house whispered, a murmur from no one's lips but from the ground, the walls, the flowers, the bones of time. Love doesn't want to last. It wants to remain. That was how I understood that to remain is not the opposite of to leave. It is the secret verb love conjugates when everything else ends. And in that instant, between the pale sky and the fragrance of jasmine, I knew. She had not kept me to destroy me, but to continue through me. The flower on the roof bent with the wind, and the sun passing through its petals cast over the house a white light, the kind that belongs to no specific hour, yet illuminates forever what was worthy of being remembered. The mansion stayed behind, unmoving, like a sleeping heart that keeps beating inside another body. And the world before me began to dawn again,